Nancy on the importance of stem cell research. And I think that everything that came out of Nuremberg as far as medical ethics was concerned supports her position. There were 10 fundamental principles of medical experimentation that were developed and enunciated in the court's opinion in the doctor's, the medical experimentation case. And I think that every one of those important principles supports the importance and the ethical rightness of stem cell research.
Mm-hmm. How do you think informed consent, as it's being administered today by physicians, what's your reaction to it?
Well, I think that in general it's being followed all over the world. There are some exceptions, and I think those exceptions are to be deplored.
Good enough. I'm good. Thanks, Greg. Okay. Thanks, Jack. Mm-hmm. Nice to meet you.
Good to meet you.
Sure, absolutely. So you still have, at least I have my reflection.
Have you got reflection on it too?
Yeah. Jack W. Robbins, welcome to Jamestown, New York.
Thank you.
I got to tell you, how I caught up with Jack W. Robbins was through that Nuremberg project, the Harvard Law Project, which has digitalized a lot of the subsequent proceedings. And the first proceeding they did was the medical case. And as I was scrolling through that, sure enough, a name that came up was Jack W. Robbins. And then the other case that they've digitalized, and they haven't done them all yet, is Oswald Pohl. And another name came up, Jack W. Robbins. And then all of a sudden, I got a letter from William Kaming, who was with you in South Carolina. And there's a picture of the whole group of you. And who's there? Jack W. Robbins. So I'm delighted to have gone on the internet and found that there's Jack W. Robbins in Jenkinstown, Pennsylvania. So all that is the basis upon which we caught up with each other, sometime a year ago. And I'm thrilled that you're here at the Jackson Center. So thanks for coming and bringing along your lovely wife of 58 years.
Thank you. It's a real privilege and a great honor for Hilda and me to be here because Jackson was one of my great heroes, and indeed he was the hero of every one of the 100 American lawyers in Nuremberg who participated in the 12 subsequent trials following the big trial that Jackson was prosecutor in.
You were born in 1919, and you were born in Texas?
Actually, I was born in a little town, Flemington, Missouri, but at a fairly young age, my parents, who ran a mom-and-pop grocery store, moved from Flemington down to Denton, Texas, and that's where I went through high school and college, and from there to law school. And that's where, in Denton, I met my lovely wife, Hilda.
Were you destined to be a lawyer?
I think so. I'm sure, because even in high school and elementary school, I went to the courthouse to listen to cases, and I was inspired by them to become a lawyer.
And after you graduated from college, you went off to law school at Columbia, right?
I did. I went to Columbia. I had a scholarship there at Columbia Law School, and I went to Columbia because I thought I would love New York, and I found that I did, and I was always glad that I went to law school in New York City and at Columbia Law School.
I'm trying to recall, your ultimate boss, Telford Taylor, didn't he have a relationship with Columbia as well?
He did. After the trials, he came back and was a professor of law at Columbia for a good many years before he died.
So you graduate from Columbia and you're hired by Cravath?
I went to, actually I spent my first year out of law school as a law clerk in Albany for the Court of Appeals, Judge Thatcher. And then the next year I went to, and I guess that was I graduated in 1943, and then in 1945 I went to the Cravath firm and was there until 1953, with 2 years out at Nuremberg.
Well, let's talk about Nuremberg. How does Jack W. Robbins, back up a little bit, while you're at Cravath, was it common to follow the IMT portion of the trial? Was that a topic of conversation here in the States?
It was, and it was something that I think every young lawyer was following.
What was the impression as things started, like in the Cravath firm, talking among your colleagues? Was this deemed to be a trial of fairness? Was it the de facto aspect of it? Was that a hot topic at the time in 1945?
I think that the lawyers that I was acquainted with were all very supportive of the Nuremberg principle and of the trials. I was in the litigation department in the Cravath office, and I had extensive trial and civil litigation experience, but of course no criminal law experience at the time.
What's the story behind how you ended up in Nuremberg?
I was recruited for the Nuremberg trials by Howard Peterson. He was Under Secretary of War, and he had been an attorney at the Cravath firm, and he knew of my litigation experience, and he offered me the opportunity of going to Nuremberg, and actually I felt that it was an opportunity to make a service to the country, and I agreed to go.
What was your only condition?
My sole condition was that my wife, a bride of 3 months, would go with me. We were married in the college chapel in Denton, Texas, and so Hilda's presence was requested in Nuremberg as a file clerk, and so she was able to go with me to Nuremberg.
Now, this was a relatively recent change in policy. As I understand it, Jackson did not permit spouses to join.
I think that's true, although there were a number of spouses present during the subsequent proceedings. In fact, General Taylor's wife, Mary, was in Nuremberg and very active in helping with the trials.
When did Hilda and you arrive in Nuremberg?
It was early spring 1946, and we returned early 1948.
What kind of indoctrination did they give? Did they give you any indoctrination while you were in the States, or?
No. I went over as General Taylor's legal assistant, and of course, as soon as I got there, I received assignments from Telford Taylor and involving drafting of the indictments and collecting evidence, and I traveled with General Taylor, Hilda and I did, all over Europe collecting evidence and talking to prospective witnesses in a good many of the capitals of Europe.
As you were preparing for the trials, did you know you were going to have the two trials that you were participating in, the doctor's trial and the Oswald Pohl trial?
No, that developed as time went on. I was involved early on in, as I said, the preparation of a good many of the trials. In fact, I worked on almost all of the 12 cases at one time or another as General Taylor's assistant.
Now, in the pool of attorneys with Taylor, how many were there? How many other lawyers were there that was?
At any one time, I guess there were probably 20, 25. Over a period of 3 years, there were about 100, but of course not that many at any one time. And there were a good many more defense attorneys, German lawyers, than American prosecutors. And on the subsequent proceedings, there were, well, each one of the 177 defendants had 1, 2, sometimes 3 or even more lawyers. So there were, and they were the best lawyers in Germany. They were all excellent defense attorneys.
So when you initially get the assignments from General Taylor, did he kind of gather you all together and say, all right, how's we're going to divide, have this division of labor, or did he kind of take you under the wing and say, Jack, I want you to do X, Y, and Z?
It was more the latter. My office was in his outer office, and so I worked with him very closely, day by day.
Okay. Now, you had a chance to interview probably quite a few of the prospective witnesses, but you also had a chance to interview one of the current defendants. How did that set up that interview? How did that interview come about with Hermann Goering?
Oh, I asked permission from the, I guess, the military government at the time to take the pre-trial deposition of Hermann Goering, and that was granted. And so I spent about an hour taking his deposition, and this was a few days before the sentencing by the military tribunal. And he was a cooperative witness, I might say, but he was also a very arrogant person. He
describe him. What did he look like?
Well, he had lost a lot of weight. I think when he was captured, he weighed around 300 pounds, and he was down to 162 pounds, and his military uniform, without insignia, hung on him like a gunny sack. When he entered the chamber, he clicked his heels and saluted, and he assumed that he was in complete charge of the interrogation.
Did you tell him in advance the areas you wanted to talk about?
Yes, and he freely admitted his complicity in the use of slave labor in the concentration camps, but he denied any knowledge of the atrocious conditions in the concentration camps.
Now,
And so his testimony, I don't think, was of any particular value to us in the Pohl case.
Did you also get a chance to interview Oswald Pohl?
Yes, and of course I cross-examined him at the trial, and a good many of the other 18 defendants.
Well, let's back up a little bit from a numerical, the numbers, how the trials were numbered. Was that chronologically, so that number 1, which was the Nazi doctor's trial, was that because that was the first one that went, or?
Well, that was the first one that was prepared to go forward. So that was case number 1. And case number 2, as I recall, was the Milch case, and Henry King was the prosecutor there, and that happened to be the second case that was ready for trial. And the third case, I've forgotten, the fourth case was the Pohl case, and General Taylor asked me to be the chief prosecutor in that case.
So going back to the Nazi doctor's case, your specific involvement with that case was what? How would you describe that?
I worked on the indictment. I helped collect the evidence. I interviewed a good many of the witnesses who had been concentration camp inmates, and I presented evidence at the trial. I think both in direct evidence and cross-examination of defendants.
Of that, the lead defendant was Karl Brandt.
Right.
And he seemed to...
He was Hitler's immediate subordinate and in charge of medical services throughout Germany.
What was your impression of him?
He was a very competent doctor, a very arrogant man. He was completely dedicated to Hitler and to the Nazi philosophy.
And he was, what was his relationship to Mengele?
I have to tell you, I can't remember. Mengele, of course, was not brought to trial in Nuremberg because he hadn't been apprehended at the time, and I don't recall the relationship. Mengele was in one of the concentration camps and would have been under Brandt's supervision, and would have been under the auspices of the officers in the Pohl case also.
Was Mengele known as, did he have the reputation during the trial that he has now, or did that sort of get developed over time as?
I think it was known that that his reputation was known at the time, but as I said, he was not present, so the case was not developed in the medical case or the Pohl case against Mengele.
Was there any suggestion that he might be tried in absentia?
I think there was a very great reluctance to try defendants in the subsequent proceedings. I don't think there were any defendants tried in absentia. I think there was only one, and that was Martin Bormann, that was tried in the first big case in absentia.
As the case was being developed against the Nazi doctors, what part of the case really struck you as, or I guess perhaps even made you emotional, that you just couldn't believe somebody would be able to do that to another human being?
Well, I think that, for example, and there were many such examples, the poison bullets that were used to shoot inmates to see how quickly the inmate would die, and then the freezing experiments were horrendous also. Concentration camp inmates were dunked in freezing water and left outside in sub-zero temperatures for hours, and many died from that kind of an experimentation. But all of the experiments that were conducted in the concentration camps were really horrendous.
Was there any sense on your part that the Nazi physician thinking was that this was in fact a justification of war, and that in fact there was some medical advances that they were hoping to accomplish?
I think that, no, I think that the philosophy behind the experimentation was not, in general, to develop medical advances. It was to see how effectively methods could be devised to kill and not to cure.
Did it surprise you that here are men who of a high education and by definition have gone through, well, in our profession, the Socratic methods and to be able to liberally think and free think, to actually get to a point in their own careers where they're so, the term I think it's been used is the Nazification of the medical profession.
It was surprising and disappointing. The doctors in Germany were an essential part of the concentration camp structure. They stood on the ramps deciding which inmates would be temporarily used for slave labor and which inmates were to be killed immediately. And the doctors, more so than any other profession in the German society, subscribed to and became Nazis. And the Nazification of the medical profession was really very effective from the standpoint of Hitler's Nazi extermination policy.
I'm reading a reference to something called the T4 procedures that were used by the Nazi physicians. I don't know if that was something that came up in the trial itself. Does the term T4?
I have to say that that doesn't ring a bell right now. That was, of course, 58 years ago, and there's an awful lot that I don't remember about the evidence. But that designation does ring a bell, but I can't describe it to you.
Well, and I can't find a definition of it either. Were most of the experiments done at specific concentration camps? Was the focus of the trial the Nazi doctor experiments at 4 or 5 concentration camps where these were occurring?
Yes, there were. Buchenwald and Dachau and 3 or 4 other were the main places where the experimentations were taking place. There were literally thousands of concentration camps throughout Germany and the occupied territories. Most people are surprised to hear that there were thousands of concentration camps. The experimentations did not take place in more than half a dozen of those camps.
In your travels with Telford Taylor, did you have reason to go to the camps themselves?
Yes, we did.
What was your first impression? Hilda, well, we'll talk to Hilda later, but here you're taking your wife into an area which, were you ready to even, had you seen movies of it? Had you seen pictures of it? Were you prepared to see it?
We had seen pictures. We had seen the pictures that were shown in the International Military Tribunal that Jackson showed. So we were prepared for seeing the concentration camps.
What was Telford Taylor's hope for results out of this particular trial, the Nazi doctors? Did he say, Jack, I hope you and the staff can accomplish this?
Yes, it was to establish that the medical profession in Germany had become so Nazified that these experiments were commonplace.
As we reflect back on that specific case, there's the reference to the judgment from that case, which has within the judgment the 10 principles, known as, I guess, commonly known as the Nuremberg Code, which first identifies this idea of informed consent. Did you know that was coming? Had you presented to the court proposed findings?
Not specifically, and it still is a mystery just how the court came to these principles. They're very well stated, and they have been observed throughout the world, but the prosecution cannot take credit for having introduced as the Nuremberg Code as a proposed findings.
What was your reaction, or what was Telford Taylor's reaction when he saw that?
Well, we were delighted with it because we realized that the court had stated exactly what we would like to see.
Is that one of the foremost legacies of the Nuremberg Trials?
I think it is, and also the Nuremberg defense being another one, namely that superior orders is not a complete defense against the commission of war crimes. The court, I think, pursuant to Justice Jackson's point of view, said that superior orders might be used as a mitigating circumstance, but it's not a defense.
After the trial, that trial was over. At what point did you leave that trial, number 1, and focus in on number 4?
Well, almost immediately. I think, in fact, before the medical case, I'm sure before the medical case was completed, I was working on the Pole case.
Mm-hmm. And in that case, you were the chief prosecutor.
Yes.
And describe a little bit about who those defendants were.
They were SS generals and colonels, mostly, who were in the administrative office of the SS, and they were responsible for the administration of the concentration camps, both in Germany and in the occupied territories. And they were one of the subdivisions of the, it's called the WVHA, the Administrative and Economic Office of the SS. One of the subdivisions was in charge of the commercial activities in connection with the concentration camps, mines and quarries and such.
And it's that aspect of this, that would be basically manned by slave labor, and that was maybe one of the reasons why you're talking to Goering?
That's true, and the defendants in that case were charged with murder, and they actually millions of murders that were committed in the concentration camps.
With Oswald Pole, in the hierarchy of things, he would have been the overseer of that whole operation?
That's true.
At that time, was the name Eichmann tossed around?
Yes. I think at that time Eichmann had not been apprehended. He was, I believe, tried several years later in Israel. His reputation was well known, but he was not tried in Nuremberg.
Was that much of the defense, as we talked about mitigation, saying it was Eichmann? I mean, I realize that because he was in a hierarchy of things. Eichmann made me do it. Was that a refrain you heard?
Yes, not just Eichmann made me do it, but the upper levels of the command made me do it, and that was one of the most common defenses.
Describe Oswald Pohl.
Pohl was a very impressive man. He was a very competent administrator. He was an ardent Nazi, and he was completely dedicated to Hitler.
As the chief prosecutor, what was your principal role in the case?
It was to see that the evidence was presented in an orderly way, and a good many, a large part of the prosecution's case in the Pohl case and in every other of the 12 cases consisted of largely of documentary evidence. The Germans were great record keepers, and we had evidence of the participation in the crimes committed, and so the primary evidence presented was the documents that the defendants themselves had created.
Now, Pohl's defense attorney was Alfred Seidel,
Yes.
and he was also, I think, defense counsel in the first IMT, and I'm trying to forget who his defendant was.
I've forgotten, but he was involved in the first case. He was a very excellent lawyer.
Were there other defendants, aside from Pohl, who sort of stood out as stood out in your mind?
There were, and at the moment I can't describe them, however.
One of the judges at the case was Musmano.
Yes.
Heard a lot about him, but describe him to us.
Judge Musmano was a very colorful judge. He was later made a judge on the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania, and he was a very colorful writer, and he was, in fact, he submitted a concurring opinion, and I believe both the medical case and the Pohl case. He was a very excellent writer, and his concurring opinions are very worthwhile.
I'm quickly looking here and can't find the results of the case were of the defendants. I know Oswald Pohl was convicted and sentenced to death.
I think there were 3 other defendants that were sentenced to death, and then a number of defendants received life sentences, and some 10 years to life, and I think there were, I believe there were 7 acquittals.
When you heard those, what was your reaction?
Well, I was disappointed, of course, that there were acquittals, but on the other hand, the fact that there were acquittals meant that it was a lot of good evidence that the courts were objective, and after studying the opinions, I had to agree that we hadn't presented sufficient evidence in those cases to get a conviction.
Did you find that, as you were presenting that particular case, was Telford Taylor much involved in that particular case, or was he kind of overviewing all 12 as they were progressing?
Yeah, he was overviewing all 12. He came to the court several times, a good many times, to observe what was going on, but he didn't. He took a large part in the preparation of the opening statement and even of the closing statements, but he didn't take part in the actual trial.
Did he deliver the opening statements?
A part of the opening statement.
Okay. One of the things that I've seen in the movie, for example, Judgment at Nuremberg, and listened to some of your contemporaries, that the Cold War, as it was developing at the time, really had an impact on the subsequent proceedings.
I think that's true. The severity of the sentences declined. All of the death sentences occurred in 3 cases that were tried early on, namely the medical case, the Pole case, and the Einsatzgruppen case. But as time went on, the sentences became less and less severe, so that toward the end of the 12 cases, the sentences were greatly mitigated. And I think that was largely because of the Cold War and the perceived need to obtain some of the expertise that the German people had to be utilized against the Russians.
Switching gears a little bit, you came in April of 1946. The IMT is in the cross-examination stage, I believe, at the time.
Yes.
Were you encouraged to attend those cross-examinations and to see what was going on?
Yes, I did that to the extent that my work on the trials permitted that.
What was your impression? You walk into the courtroom for the first time and you see on the dock some of the pictures you see around our Goering and Hess and Ribbentrop and Keitel, people who you'd seen on the newsreels.
My main impression was the great effectiveness that Robert H. Jackson had in that case. He was just superb, and I think his contribution to the development of the Nuremberg Trials was just incalculable. He was magnificent.
Among the staff people who had underneath, what was the conversation at that level about Jackson to date? I mean, you come in April and you're sort of integrated with some people who'd been there the whole time. Was there a conversation as to how the trial was going, how it was proceeding?
Yes, there was a lot of conversation along those lines, and I think in general it was all quite affirmative.
Did they talk at all about the Goering cross-examination? And that's one area where they probably felt Jackson didn't shine as well as he did in other areas.
There was that kind of talk, but I think that everyone felt that Jackson really had done a good job.
Mm-hmm. Were you there at the closing statement?
Yes.
What was your impression of that?
It was magnificent. Of course, Jackson's opening and closing were just fantastic. They were real milestones in the history of law.
When the verdicts came out on October 1st, 1946, were there some surprises? There were 3 acquittals.
There were 3 acquittals. Let's see, von Papen, Schott, and
Fritchie.
Fritchie, yes. I think Jackson was disappointed in a couple of those cases, and there was a lot of conversation about that, but again, the acquittals established beyond doubt that the court was objective and fair.
Did you have any impression of the defendants as you were looking at them? When you saw Rudolf Hess or Ribbentrop, anything that's kind of jumped in your mind and sort of became impressed that?
I can't recall anything specific along that line.
I'm sure you've been asked 100 times, but what is the legacy of the Nuremberg Trials?
I think the primary legacy is the establishment of the principle that of criminal responsibility for even the heads of state. And this, the trials themselves are international trials. They were international criminal trials, and I think that is the legacy of Nuremberg.
In 1948, you come back, and that was that right after the conclusion of the Oswald Pohl trial?
It was, yes, it was shortly after. I think we came back in late December, the last days of December 1947. And then I returned to the Cravath firm in early 1948.
We asked the question last night, and we gave you a night to think about it. When you came back across the pond and back to the Cravath firm, and you'd just been imprinted with the fact you were at Nuremberg and a Nuremberg prosecutor for 18, 19, 20 months, what was the reaction when you came back into the firm? Did people want you to talk about it?
Yes, and the lawyers at the Cravath office had a favorable impression of the Nuremberg trials and the Nuremberg principles, and I returned to the litigation department, and my experience in those trials was given credit, and I resumed my litigation experience there.
In your community where you were living at the time, was there a sense of celebrity at all that you were at Nuremberg?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so.
Have you kept in touch with some of your colleagues?
Yes, I've appeared on several programs with Henry King and Ben Ferencz and Drexel Sprecher and some of the others. And I'm always glad to see them. I think Whitney Harris was on one of the programs, and several others.
Mm-hmm. When you talk today, is it principally to college students?
Yes, and also to churches and synagogues and colleges, and I'm very happy to see that a good many colleges have courses on the Holocaust, and I'm glad to see that that's not being forgotten. I happen to be, I've been on the board of trustees of Ursinus College, and Ursinus College has an excellent program on the Holocaust.
What's your message to the students?
It is that the principles of Nuremberg are not to be forgotten, that these crimes actually did occur, and that they could occur again if we are not vigilant.
Mm-hmm. Are you following the Milosevic trial and the development of the Hussein trial and its parallels, if any?
Yes, and we recently went to The Hague to see the Milosevic trial. Unfortunately, it was in recess at the time we were in The Hague, so we didn't see that, but I have been following that. And of course, everyone is interested in the cases that will develop out of the prisoner abuses in Iraq.
Is there a relevancy today to what happened at Nuremberg as they're being applied?
I think there is a relevancy, and one point that stands out is that we're all capable of some inhumane acts, and the principle of law has to be developed and instilled strongly to prevent such horrendous acts.
This is terrific. You're the best. We're going to spend a second here with Hilda.
Okay.
So your husband of 3 months comes in one day and says, Hilda, guess what? We're going to Nuremberg. What do you think? What would you reaction?
I'm just an innocent little girl from a country town in Texas, but if you're going, I'm going.
Did you know, had you been following the trial?
Somewhat. I was working on toward my master's degree, and you know, I kept up with the papers and limited radio reports, not much television, I don't think in those days, none. And I had I was a college debater, a high school debater. Debating is a big deal in the South, and it was then. So, you know, having that kind of background kept me interested in what was going on in these kind of cases.
Did Robert Jackson mean anything to you in 1946?
I can't say that he did until I got to Nuremberg.
And did you have reason when you got to Nuremberg to go and attend any of the trials?
I was able to go in. As Jack said, you know, you sort of had to work your schedules of whatever had to be done. When I first got there, as Jack said, I was identified as a file clerk, which is about like being a private in the Army, and I really didn't have much to do, particularly since the man who I was working under identified almost everything as MISC, miscellaneous, so my filing was very simple, and I would go in. And then later, after I took over the job in the cafeteria, our dinner, I mean, we were serving lunch at midday, and that was over after the kitchen help and all were doing the cleaning up. Then I would go up, and usually I would stay a good part of the afternoon. And later, when some of the other trials began, I guess there were 2 or 3 at the same time, I would go. Jack would tell me which one might be most interesting, and we had a driver that took us from the courthouse to the house where we were living, and so I would wait until Jack had finished in his whatever he was doing so we could go home together.
And the first trial, and you walk in, as I asked Jack, and the first time you take a look, and there's Hermann Goering. What was your reaction?
It was, I guess nowadays you would call it body language, you know, the way he sat and everything. And I remember they always seemed to have the same, not the same identical body language, but they would repeat the way they sat the day before. It seemed to me that whether they were slouching or whether they were standing up, sitting up straight.
Was there any impression when you looked down the dock and you saw Hess, Keitel, that maybe these guys were, you couldn't imagine looking at them today, that they were so powerful?
It was hard to imagine, and I guess that even the immensity of their atrocities was not as well focused on by me at that time as it went on during the trials, you know. So the more you learned about the widespread crimes against humanity, as it was worded, were just so awful that it was hard to imagine. Jack ended what he was saying about being vigilant, and it could happen. I read recently an account of the part of the South, particularly Georgia and South Carolina, in the Revolutionary War. And there were some tremendous atrocities carried on by both the people who were revolting and by the Brits who were representing the king here. And it's really shocked me to read about that. I was reading it just about the same time all of the news was coming out of Iraq, and I thought, what is there about war that brings out such inhuman activity?
Yeah. Your role there became from a file clerk to your background was as a dietitian, and then you kind of got intimately involved in the nutrition of the...
Well, we were feeding all of the defense attorneys and all, there's a tremendous support staff there. There were translators and interrogators and a lot of other people in addition to just the usual support people. They were all having lunch there, and when we got there, everybody was having lunch off of an aluminum tray like the soldiers were using and complaining about the food. And when Telford asked me if I thought I could do anything about it, I think that's the way he put it, I said, yeah, I think so. And I didn't know what I was going to do, but I was 22 years old and I thought I could do anything. And so I asked the head chef one day about getting some china for people to eat off of, and not long after that he said, Frau Robbins, are you going to inventory the sugar anytime soon? And I said, no, I don't think so. And he said, what about the coffee? I said, no. Of course, I didn't know I was supposed to, being in a military situation there. And a week or 10 days later, he turned up with a complete service. I mean, 4 or 5 pieces in each place setting for 1,200 people. And we started eating off of that there in the courthouse cafeteria. And everybody thought the food improved tremendously. I hadn't made very many changes because there wasn't much room for change. You had what the Army could supply you in the way mostly of canned food. But it did help everybody's feeling, I think, of being a little more civilized.
So not only did you had the German Defense Council, and did they sit by themselves?
Yes, they did.
Was there much, well, I guess was there any fraternization among the...
I was not aware that there was. They had pretty strict regulations about that at the time. So, I was sort of aware of not being too overly involved even with my staff there. I had a big staff because Nuremberg was the center of practically everything. I mean, everything in Europe. That's where it was really focused. So the best chefs and the best former maitre d's had turned up there in Nuremberg and were employed, and they were good. But I was at the same time I never became very overly involved with anyone. There was a Herr Altman that was very helpful. That's about the only name I can remember from there.
Did you employ a lot of German people to serve?
Those all German.
All German. And you also, as far as the judges were concerned, you served
Yes. The judges ate in their chambers, and our staff, certain ones, took it up to them. And then after I started in the cafeteria. Well, I decided I would serve the judges tea about the middle of the afternoon, and that pleased them and made them think that things were getting better, I guess, in that department.
You weren't involved with the serving of the judges during the first trial, were you?
No. No, it was after that I took on this job.
What was the sense of the German employees that were there as far as the trial itself? Was it just a job? Was there any kind of cathartic?
I think as much as they learned about it, they thought this couldn't have happened. And I remember they were showing some particular pictures in one of Jack's cases. And these were concentration camp pictures that were taken, you know. And we took the woman who was our cook at the home where we were billeted in to see these. She had been a school teacher. And she said, that couldn't have happened. We would have known that if that was happening. We would have known. Her father was an architect, and she said he didn't know there were any buildings like that. And, you know, it was just complete denial.
Mm-hmm. What was describe Nuremberg?
Oh, it was, you can't imagine the destruction. A lot of the Air Force strikes had been aimed at Nuremberg because it was kind of that symbol where the big amphitheater was, where Hitler made speeches. So it was very much destroyed. And the fact that it was a walled city, a tremendous wall around most of the city, and that was torn down in certain places, you know, there would be these big gaps in it. And there were people out, though, every day cleaning up with very elementary sort of tools, and I mean, there are no big bulldozers scooping up things. They were putting things in wheelbarrows and carting off the trash and the debris. I remember, speaking of debris, one time we went to Warsaw for the opening of the trial of the man, the Nazi who had been the head in Warsaw. He was the chief. And they were starting to try him there. And of course we got a tour. And we went to where the Warsaw Ghetto had been, and Hitler's instructions, or maybe Goering's, were not to leave any two brick together, just to absolutely level it. And that was the way, when you looked from a certain point, it looked like you were looking maybe at a roughly plowed field or something, because they literally had just completely obliterated that ghetto area. It was hard to believe. There was no hotel in Warsaw. We were billeted at a museum that was about 20 miles out of the city, I remember, for that few days that we were there. Describe
Telford Taylor.
Oh, he was very generalish looking man. He stood straight and he had very slim, and he was friendly, very friendly from the very beginning. He was very friendly, and he didn't act like a general, so to speak, but he looked like the part. He was a wonderful dancer. He was a very tall man, and they had an orchestra that played at a place called the Officers Club there, and I know when we went there that I enjoyed dancing with him. And the Russians were wonderful dancers too. They really knew how to get you around over the floor.
We'll talk about the Russians. Was there much interaction? I mean, you never hear much about them.
No, not very much. They, of course, these, I guess, were the prosecutors and their assistants, and maybe their translators that were, or probably not the translator, but anyway, you know, it was that part of the Russian delegation, but it was only when I would dance with one of them that I was very much aware of them being there.
Well, I understand Mosmano was quite a dancer.
Oh, the women laughed and talked about jumping and pumping with Masmano. He sort of jumped as he danced, and he would hold you, and he would pump his arms up and down like that. So we would laugh about, oh, I see you've been jumping and pumping with Masmano. Isn't that awful? Well, you had to be a little sarcastic and keep the humor going.
Oh, I think that's terrific.
You know, I got to be very good at trading cigarettes. Jack and I neither smoke, and we were allotted a carton a week. And after my chef found all of this good china, well, I asked him if by any chance he could get us a couple of bicycles. And he said, well, he thought he could with enough cigarettes, and I've forgotten how many, but wasn't too long after that that he brought us one man's bicycle, one women's bicycle, and the Germans had wonderful bicycle paths through the forests and areas, so it made it a lot of fun, and we didn't have too much time for that, but when we could, well, we would enjoy our bicycle. We brought our bicycles home with us.
Oh, that's terrific. Terrific. I'm going to switch tapes here for a second.